A cry in the dark. A quiet evening walk. Dr. James Lawson never anticipated that his life would change forever on a simple evening walk. It was a crisp autumn evening, the sky painted in shades of amber and deep purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant aroma of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor near the park entrance. Margaret, his wife, walked beside him, her fingers lightly brushing against his. These evening walks had become a ritual for them, an attempt to fill the silent void that echoed through their house. After years of trying and failing to have a child of their own, they had learned to accept their reality, though the ache of unfulfilled dreams never truly faded. "James," Margaret said softly, squeezing his hand, "do you ever wonder what life would be like if things had gone differently?" Dr. Lawson looked down at his wife, seeing the familiar sadness in her hazel eyes. He pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "Every day," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But even if things didn't go as we planned, I still have you. And that means everything." Margaret smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just wish." She stopped mid-sentence, her body tensing as a faint, almost imperceptible sound broke through the quiet hum of the city. A cry. James stopped walking, his brows furrowed. "Did you hear that?" Margaret nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. The sound was faint, barely more than a whimper, but unmistakably the desperate wail of an infant. The couple exchanged a glance before following the sound, their steps quickening as the cry grew louder. A horrifying discovery. The path led them toward the edge of the park, where a row of dumpsters lined a back alley. The cries became more frantic, more urgent. Margaret's heart pounded as James approached the trash bins, his doctor's instincts already kicking in. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. James peered into the nearest dumpster, his breath hitching as he saw the tiny bundle wrapped in filthy, tattered rags. He reached in, his hands trembling, and carefully lifted the fragile infant. The baby was no more than a few hours old, its skin dark but unnaturally pale from the cold. Her tiny fists were curled tightly, her face scrunched in distress. "She's freezing," James murmured, pulling the baby close to his chest in an attempt to warm her. "We need to get her to the hospital. Now." Margaret, still in shock, nodded quickly. "I'll call an ambulance." "No time," James said, already moving. His heart pounded against his ribs as he sprinted toward the nearest street, Margaret struggling to keep up. "She doesn't have much time." The world around them blurred as James ran, the weight of the tiny life in his arms more significant than anything he had ever carried. His breath was ragged, but he didn't stop, didn't slow. Margaret ran ahead, pushing open the emergency room doors just as James reached the hospital steps. A race against time. "I need help here," James shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. A nurse rushed forward, her eyes widening as she saw the fragile infant in his arms. "What happened?" she asked, already motioning for a gurney. "Found her in a dumpster," James said, his voice tight. "She's hypothermic, dehydrated, and severely underweight." The nurse nodded, immediately taking the baby from his arms and wrapping her in a warm blanket. Another nurse pressed a stethoscope to the infant's tiny chest, listening intently before shouting orders to the medical staff. "Get a warming bed ready. We need fluids, stat." James and Margaret stood frozen as they watched the hospital team work, their world narrowing to the small incubator where the tiny girl was placed. The machines beeped steadily, the sound a fragile lifeline between life and death. Margaret reached for James' hand, squeezing it tightly. "Is she going to be okay?" James swallowed hard, his medical expertise warring with his emotions. "She's a fighter," he said, watching the baby's chest rise and fall. "She just needs a little help." The couple remained by her side, unwilling to leave, even as the hours ticked by. The question that changed everything. By dawn, the tiny girl had stabilized. Her breathing was stronger, her skin no longer tinged with a dangerous bluish hue. James sat beside the incubator, exhaustion weighing down on him, but he refused to leave. Margaret was beside him, her gaze fixed on the small bundle. "She needs a name," she whispered. James turned to her, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. Margaret met his gaze, determination shining through the exhaustion. She was left alone, abandoned like she didn't matter. But she does. She matters. And she deserves a name. James hesitated, his heart pounding as he looked back at the tiny girl who had already burrowed her way into his soul. "Hope," he said finally, "because that's what she is. A little hope in the dark." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Hope," she repeated, testing the name on her lips. "It's perfect." For the first time in years, something inside of James shifted. The emptiness, the longing that had haunted them for so long, had found an answer. As the hospital began its search for the child's biological family, James and Margaret never left Hope's side. The days passed, and with each moment, their attachment to her deepened. Then, one evening, Margaret whispered the words that James had been avoiding. "What if we didn't let her go?" James turned to his wife, his heart pounding at the implication. "Margaret, we've wanted this for so long," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "And I know it won't be easy. But I love her, James. I already love her." James looked at Hope, her tiny fingers curled into a fist, her chest rising and falling steadily. He felt the same pull, the same fierce protectiveness he had felt from the moment he'd lifted her out of that dumpster. Could they do it? Could they fight for her? As Margaret reached for his hand, her eyes searching his, James knew there was only one answer. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady. Little did they know, their fight for hope was only just beginning. The fight for hope. A silent agreement. Dr. James Lawson sat in his study, staring at the medical files on his desk, but his mind was nowhere near his work. Across the dimly lit room, Margaret paced restlessly, her arms crossed over her chest, her face filled with unspoken determination. They both knew what they wanted. They had both come to love the baby girl sleeping in the neonatal unit just a few floors below. It had only been days since they found her abandoned in that dumpster, but in that short time, she had become theirs in a way they never expected. Margaret finally stopped pacing and turned to James, her eyes fierce. "We can't let her go." James exhaled deeply, his fingers running through his graying hair. "I know." It was the first time he admitted it out loud, and the weight of those words settled in his chest like a boulder. They both knew what this meant, the uphill battle that lay ahead, the legal red tape, the potential backlash. Margaret moved closer, lowering herself onto the couch beside him. "James, I've seen the way you look at her," she said softly. "You love her." James swallowed hard. "She's already ours, isn't she?" Margaret nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Yes." And just like that, the decision was made. They would fight for hope, no matter what it took. An unexpected obstacle. The next morning, Margaret and James met with the hospital's social worker, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Evans. She had been assigned to oversee the case, and from the moment she walked into the meeting room, her expression was unreadable. "I understand you both have formed an attachment to the infant," Diane said, adjusting the thick-framed glasses on her nose. "But these situations aren't simple." "We want to foster her," Margaret said immediately, sitting up straighter. "We've already looked into the process, and we're more than capable of providing for her." James nodded, his hands clasped together. "We're both financially stable, we have a safe home, and I'm a doctor. If anyone can take care of her, we can." Diane sighed, flipping through the file in front of her. "I understand, but we have to follow the legal process. The authorities are still looking for her biological parents. If they are found, they will have the first right to claim her." Margaret clenched her fists. "And if they aren't found?" "Then she will enter the foster system," Diane replied carefully, "where she will be placed with a licensed foster family." Margaret's heart dropped. "We could be that family," she argued. We'll do whatever it takes. Diane hesitated. I won't lie to you, Dr. and Mrs. Lawson, she said, finally closing the file. Even if you apply to foster her, there's no guarantee you'll be chosen. There are certain complexities to consider. James narrowed his eyes. Complexities. Diane hesitated before continuing, lowering her voice slightly. Hope is a black child, she said carefully, and you are a white couple. The system strongly considers placing children with families that match their racial and cultural background. Margaret's jaw tightened. So because we're white, we might lose her. Diane sighed. It's not that simple. We have to consider the child's best interests, including her ability to connect with her culture as she grows up. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. And what about love? He asked quietly. Doesn't that count for something? Diane studied them for a long moment before finally nodding. It does, and I can see you truly care about this child. But be prepared. This won't be easy. Margaret and James exchanged a glance. They didn't care how hard it would be. They weren't giving up. The first battle. The first step was filing for emergency foster placement. It was an exhausting process. Paperwork, interviews, home evaluations. Every day that passed felt like another moment Hope spent in limbo. Margaret threw herself into the process, researching transracial adoption, connecting with other families who had done the same, and preparing their home. She decorated the nursery in soft yellows and greens, filling it with books and stuffed animals, trying to create the perfect space for Hope. James, on the other hand, tackled the legal side. He met with lawyers, reached out to contacts in child services, and ensured they had everything in place for their application. Still, there was one thing they couldn't control: time. And then, just as they thought they were making progress, they received devastating news. A shocking discovery. James was in his office at the hospital when Diane called. We found a potential relative, she said carefully. James felt his stomach drop. Who? A woman named Lillian Barnes. She claims to be the baby's maternal grandmother. James gripped the edge of his desk. And she wants custody. She's considering it, Diane admitted. She didn't even know her daughter was pregnant. But now that she does, she's trying to determine the best course of action. James' mind raced. A biological relative. That changed everything. If Lillian Barnes wanted to take Hope, there was almost nothing he and Margaret could do to stop it. When he told Margaret later that evening, she sank onto the couch, tears welling in her eyes. A grandmother. Where has she been all this time? James sighed. She didn't know about the baby. But now that she does. Margaret shook her head fiercely. No, she doesn't even know Hope. We're the ones who have been here. We're the ones who love her. James pulled Margaret into his arms. We're not giving up, he murmured. No matter what. A desperate plea. Days later, they received the call. Lillian Barnes had agreed to meet them. The meeting took place in a small, quiet cafe in the city. Lillian was a tall, dignified woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her dark eyes studied them carefully as they sat across from her. I appreciate you coming, Lillian said, her voice calm but guarded. Margaret, her heart pounding, leaned forward. We just want to talk. We want to do what's best for Hope. Lillian's expression softened slightly at the mention of the baby's name. Hope, she murmured. That's what you named her. James nodded. She's been fighting since the moment we found her. We thought it was fitting. Lillian exhaled slowly. I never knew my daughter was pregnant, she admitted. I lost her to drugs years ago. She cut ties with me, and I spent years wondering where she was. Then suddenly, I get a call saying she had a baby and abandoned her. I don't know how to process that. Margaret reached for Lillian's hand. We don't want to take her from her family, but we love her, and we will give her everything. Lillian studied them, her gaze unreadable. And you think you can teach her what it means to be black in this world? She asked quietly. Margaret swallowed. "We know we can't teach her everything, but we will make sure she knows her culture, her history. We will surround her with people who can help her understand that part of herself." Lillian sat in silence for a long time before finally nodding. "I need time to think." And with that, she stood and left, leaving James and Margaret sitting in anxious uncertainty. The wait. For days, they heard nothing. Every phone call made Margaret's heart leap. Every knock at the door sent a shiver down James' spine. And then, finally, Diane called. "She's made a decision," Diane said, her voice unreadable. James held his breath. And there was a pause. "She wants you to raise hope," Diane said, "but she wants to be in her life." James and Margaret looked at each other, their eyes wide with relief and disbelief. They had won. Hope was staying with them, but their journey was far from over. A family forged in love. A new beginning. It had been a week since Lillian Barnes made her decision, a decision that changed everything for James and Margaret. Hope was theirs to raise, to love, and to nurture, but with one important condition: Lillian would be a part of her life. It was a compromise that Margaret and James were willing to make, even though they knew it wouldn't be easy. The relief of knowing they wouldn't lose hope was overwhelming. But a new set of concerns settled over them. How would this co-parenting arrangement work? Would Lillian accept them as Hope's parents, or would she try to take her away down the line? One thing was certain: they weren't just fighting to keep Hope anymore. They were fighting to build a bridge between two worlds. And so, their journey as a family truly began. Bringing Hope home. The day James and Margaret finally brought Hope home was a mixture of excitement, fear, and quiet disbelief. Margaret stood in the nursery they had prepared, running her hands over the soft blankets in the crib, adjusting the stuffed animals neatly arranged in the corner. It felt surreal to think that soon, this room would no longer be a quiet, empty space. It would be filled with the soft coos and tiny giggles of a baby who had already stolen their hearts. James walked in, carrying Hope in her car seat. He set it down gently in the center of the nursery and exhaled deeply. "Well," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "she's home." Margaret knelt beside the car seat, unbuckling the tiny baby and lifting her into her arms. Hope's dark brown eyes blinked up at her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Margaret pressed a kiss to her forehead, her heart swelling with love. "Welcome home, sweet girl," she whispered. James sat beside them, watching Margaret cradle Hope. He reached out, gently stroking the baby's soft curls. "She's so small," he murmured. "It's hard to believe something this tiny can change everything." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with certainty. "She was always meant to be ours, James." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. That night, as they laid Hope down in her crib, Margaret and James stood side by side, watching over her. The quiet hum of the baby monitor filled the room, a stark contrast to the deafening silence that had once consumed their home. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. For the first time in years, their family felt whole. Navigating the new normal. Over the next few weeks, James and Margaret adjusted to life as parents. The sleepless nights, the endless diaper changes, the round-the-clock feedings, it was overwhelming, exhausting, and more fulfilling than anything they had ever experienced. Margaret threw herself into motherhood, reading every book she could find on parenting and child development. James, ever the perfectionist, tracked Hope's growth meticulously, ensuring she was meeting every milestone. But amidst the chaos of new parenthood, there was another challenge they had to navigate: Lillian Barnes. Their first official meeting with her after bringing Hope home was filled with unspoken tension. They met at a small cafe, choosing a quiet corner where they wouldn't be disturbed. Lillian sat across from them, her eyes scanning Hope as Margaret rocked her gently. "She looks healthy," Lillian finally said, her voice neutral. "She is," James replied. "She's growing stronger every day." Lillian nodded, but there was something guarded about her expression. "I want to be in her life," she said firmly. "Not just on birthdays or special occasions. I want her to know who she is, where she comes from." Margaret glanced at James before responding. "We want that too," she said carefully. "We don't want to take her from her roots. We want to teach her about her culture, her history." Lillian studied them, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You say that now, but will you still feel that way when she's older? When she starts asking questions you can't answer?" James inhaled deeply, choosing his words carefully. "We won't pretend to have all the answers, but we will make sure she grows up knowing both love and truth. We want her to know where she came from, and we want her to know that she is deeply loved." Lillian was silent for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right," she said. "Then let's do this right." Building a bridge. Over the next few months, Lillian became a quiet but steady presence in Hope's life. At first, her visits were infrequent. An afternoon here, a short visit there. She was careful, almost hesitant, as if trying to figure out where she fit into Hope's world. But slowly, things began to change. Lillian started coming over more often, bringing books and toys for Hope. She would sit in the rocking chair in the nursery, reading softly while Hope lay in her crib, wide-eyed and attentive. Sometimes she would tell stories of her own childhood, of Hope's mother, of the family that had come before her. Margaret and James watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. They wanted Hope to have a connection to her heritage, but there was always a lingering fear. What if Lillian changed her mind? What if she decided one day that she wanted more? One evening, after Lillian had left, Margaret turned to James as they cleaned up the living room. "Do you think she still wants to take Hope?" she asked quietly. James set down the book he had been flipping through. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. She loves Hope. That much is clear." Margaret sighed. "I just want to do this right." James reached for her hand. "We will." The first real test. Things seemed to be settling into a new rhythm, until the first major argument. It happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon during one of Lillian's visits. Hope, now 6 months old, was sitting on the floor with Margaret, playing with a set of brightly colored blocks. Lillian watched from the couch, her arms crossed. "She needs black dolls," Lillian said suddenly. Margaret looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" Lillian gestured to the toys around them. "All of these dolls and stuffed animals. They don't look like her." Margaret frowned. "I didn't think." "That's the problem," Lillian interrupted. "You didn't think. She needs to see herself in her toys, in the books she reads. If she only ever sees white faces, what message do you think that sends?" James, sensing the rising tension, interjected. "Lillian, we're trying our best. We want to make sure she has a strong sense of identity." "Then do better," Lillian said sharply, "because love isn't enough. She needs to grow up knowing who she is." Margaret, feeling defensive, crossed her arms. "We never said we wouldn't teach her about her heritage. But are you really prepared to?" Lillian challenged. "Are you ready for the questions she'll ask? The stares she'll get? The way people will treat her differently?" Silence filled the room. Margaret exhaled, her frustration melting into something else. Understanding. "You're right," she admitted softly. "We don't know everything, but we want to learn." Lillian's gaze softened. "Then start now." A turning point. That night, Margaret scoured the internet, ordering books, dolls, and artwork that reflected Hope's culture. She and James reached out to local Black parenting groups, seeking advice, building connections. And slowly, something shifted. Lillian started smiling more when she visited. The tension between them eased, replaced by something new: respect. A shared understanding that they were all working toward the same goal: to give Hope the best life possible. To be a family, no matter how unconventional. James watched as Lillian rocked Hope to sleep one evening, humming a lullaby he didn't recognize. Margaret leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulder. They had come so far. And yet, their journey was only just beginning. Shadows from the past. A life filled with love. 2 years had passed since the day James and Margaret had officially become Hope's parents. Their once quiet house was now a whirlwind of laughter, spilled juice, and the delightful chaos that came with raising a toddler. Hope was a force of nature. Her curls bounced as she ran through the house, her laughter filling every room with warmth. She was curious, stubborn, and filled with an energy that left Margaret exhausted but overjoyed. James, who had once been meticulous and rigid in his routines, found himself frequently attending tea parties hosted by a 2-year-old in a tutu, pretending to sip invisible tea from plastic cups. It wasn't always easy. There were tantrums, sleepless nights, and days when Margaret felt like she was failing. But no matter what challenges came, there was an unshakable truth. Hope was their daughter, and they loved her more than anything in the world. Lillian had become a steady presence in Hope's life. What had started as cautious visits had transformed into something deeper. She was no longer just an observer. She was family. She taught Hope lullabies passed down from her own childhood, braided her curls with the gentle patience only a grandmother could possess, and filled their home with stories of the past. For a while, life felt almost perfect. Then the letter arrived. The letter that changed everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when James found the envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just his name printed neatly on the front. Margaret was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming as she flipped pancakes, while Hope sat in her high chair, clapping her hands excitedly. Everything about the scene was normal, domestic, safe. James hesitated for a moment before tearing open the envelope. As his eyes scanned the words inside, his heart clenched. Dr. Lawson, I know who you are. I know what you did. And I know the child you're raising isn't yours. Her real family hasn't forgotten her. They're coming for her. Soon. James felt the blood drain from his face. His hands trembled as he read the words over and over, his mind racing. Who had sent this? Was it a hoax? A cruel joke? Or something more? James? Margaret's voice pulled him back to the present. What's wrong? He looked up, his heart pounding, and saw the concern in her eyes. He glanced at Hope, who was happily smearing syrup on her face, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. We need to talk, James said, his voice low. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and joined him at the table. What is it? James handed her the letter. As she read it, her face paled, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, this can't be happening. James reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. We don't know what it means yet. It could be nothing. Margaret looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. But what if it's not? They sat in silence, the weight of the letter pressing down on them. Then, for the first time in years, the fear of losing hope crept back into their hearts. A frantic search for answers. James wasted no time. He called Diane Evans, the social worker who had handled Hope's case, but she had no new information. I haven't heard anything, Diane said. No one has come forward to claim her, but I'll look into it. Not satisfied with waiting, James took it upon himself to do some digging. He reached out to Detective Sarah Miller, who had originally investigated Hope's abandonment. Dr. Lawson, Miller said when he arrived at the precinct, I haven't seen you in a while. James placed the letter on her desk. This came in the mail today. She picked it up, reading it carefully. Her expression darkened. You think it's real? I don't know, James admitted, but I need to find out. Miller leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her desk. The case went cold a long time ago. We never found out who left Hope in that dumpster. No witnesses, no leads. James clenched his jaw. Could her biological parents still be out there? Possibly, Miller said. But if they wanted her back, why now? That was the question that haunted him. The unraveling of secrets. As the days passed, James and Margaret tried to go about life as usual, but the letter lingered in the back of their minds. They didn't tell Lillian. Not yet. They didn't want to scare her until they had more information. Then, another letter arrived. This time, it was slipped under their front door in the middle of the night. Time is running out. You can't hide her forever. Margaret broke down when she read it. James, what are we going to do? We're going to protect her, James said firmly. No matter what. He installed new locks on the doors. Security cameras. He even had a friend at the hospital pull some favors to check if there had been any unusual inquiries about Hope. Then, one night, the phone rang. James picked up. Hello. A deep voice on the other end. You have something that belongs to me. James felt his body go rigid. Who is this? A low chuckle. You already know. The line went dead. James stood frozen, the dial tone ringing in his ears. Someone was coming for Hope. A dangerous revelation. Unable to sit still, James called Detective Miller again. I need everything you have on Hope's biological mother. There has to be something. Miller sighed but agreed to meet him. When James arrived, she had a file waiting for him. There's not much, she admitted. Her mother was a woman named Vanessa Barnes. She had a history of drug abuse. She vanished after giving birth. We never found her. James opened the file, flipping through arrest records, hospital reports, missing person reports. Then, one document caught his eye. It was a police report from 3 years ago, 6 months before Hope had been abandoned. James' stomach twisted. It was an arrest record for a man named Darius King. The charge: drug trafficking, assault, attempted murder, and listed under known associates was one name that sent chills down James' spine. Vanessa Barnes. James looked up at Miller. Who is Darius King? Miller exhaled sharply. He's bad news. A known gang leader. Ruthless. James' blood turned to ice. What if Hope wasn't just abandoned? He asked slowly. What if someone was trying to hide her? Miller's expression darkened. If King was involved with Vanessa, and if he thinks Hope is his, she didn't need to finish the sentence. James stood, gripping the file in his hands. I have to get home. Miller placed a hand on his arm. Be careful, Dr. Lawson. James didn't reply. He had one thought in his mind. Someone dangerous might be coming for his daughter, and he would do anything to stop them. A dangerous past resurfaces. A race against time. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he sped home. His mind raced through every terrifying possibility. If Darius King truly believed Hope was his child, what would he do to get her back? He was a known criminal, someone with a violent history. James didn't doubt for a second that King was capable of taking drastic measures. His heart pounded as he pulled into the driveway, practically jumping out of the car. He rushed into the house, calling out as he locked the door behind him. Margaret. In the nursery, she answered. James sprinted up the stairs and found Margaret sitting on the floor with Hope, helping her stack colorful wooden blocks. The sight momentarily softened the panic clawing at his chest. Hope, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her, clapped her tiny hands together, proud of her wobbly tower. Margaret looked up and immediately noticed James' expression. What is it? What happened? James hesitated, glancing at Hope. He didn't want to scare her. Let's talk downstairs, he said quietly. Margaret nodded, her face tightening with concern. She stood, lifting Hope into her arms. Sweetie, why don't you play with your blocks for a few minutes? Mommy and Daddy will be right back. Hope pouted but eventually nodded. Okay, Mommy. As soon as they were downstairs, Margaret turned to James. You're scaring me. What's going on? James took a deep breath, his hand shaking slightly as he handed her the police file. I think I know who's been sending the letters. Margaret's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, scanning the name Darius King. Who is he? She whispered. James ran a hand through his hair. A dangerous man. A known gang leader. He was involved with Hope's biological mother, Vanessa, And if he thinks Hope is his. Margaret's breath hitched. Then he might try to take her. James nodded grimly. We need to act now. Reinforcing their defenses. Neither of them wasted any time. That night, James called Lillian, explaining everything. Lillian was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with worry. I knew Vanessa had demons, but I never imagined this. We need your help, James admitted. If we have to fight for custody again, the more people we have in our corner, the better. Lillian didn't hesitate. You have my full support. After hanging up, James and Margaret took every precaution they could think of. James installed a state-of-the-art security system with cameras around the house. He added extra locks to the doors and made sure Margaret had a panic button linked to the police. Margaret, meanwhile, started reaching out to lawyers, preparing for a legal battle if it came to that. If this man tries to claim custody, we need to be ready, she told James. But deep down, they both knew criminals like Darius King didn't always play by legal rules. A face from the past. Days passed in tense anticipation. James and Margaret kept Hope close, never letting her out of their sight. Then, one evening, while James was locking up the house, a car slowed outside their driveway. James froze. A black SUV, its windows tinted, lingered just a little too long before finally pulling away. His pulse quickened. Was that just paranoia, or were they being watched? The following day, as James was leaving work, someone was waiting for him in the parking lot. A man in his late 30s, tall and lean, with sharp eyes and a scar running down the side of his face. Dr. Lawson, the man said smoothly, stepping toward him. James' body tensed. Who are you? The man smirked. Call me Trey. I work for someone who wants to talk to you. James' throat went dry. Darius King. Trey tilted his head. Smart man. Mr. King doesn't like being kept from what belongs to him. James' fists clenched. Hope does not belong to him. Trey let out a low chuckle. See, that's where we disagree. But Mr. King is a reasonable man. He just wants to have a conversation. James didn't believe that for a second. Trey leaned in slightly. Meet him tomorrow night. No cops. No lawyers. Just you. He'll be expecting you at East Side Park, 9 p.m. James glared at him. And if I don't show up? Trey's smirk faded. Then Mr. King might have to take matters into his own hands. James' blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. A dangerous decision. James told Margaret everything when he got home. You can't go, she said immediately, panic rising in her voice. It's too dangerous. James sighed, rubbing his forehead. I know, but if I don't go, he won't stop. He'll come after Hope. Margaret clenched her fists. Then we call the police. And tell them what? That a gang leader wants to meet with me. James shook his head. We don't have enough to get them involved yet. Margaret's voice trembled. James, I can't lose you. James reached out, cupping her face gently. You won't. Margaret swallowed hard. Then I'm coming with you. James shook his head firmly. No, I need you to stay with Hope. If anything happens, I need to know she's safe. Margaret bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. Promise me you'll come home. James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. I promise. The meeting. The following night, James arrived at East Side Park just before 9 p.m. The park was nearly empty, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. Darius King. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sleek black suit. His eyes were cold, calculating. James stood his ground as King approached. You've been raising my daughter, King said, his voice smooth but laced with an undercurrent of menace. James didn't flinch. Hope is not yours. King chuckled. That's not what her mother told me. James clenched his jaw. Vanessa abandoned her. She left her to die. King's expression darkened. And you think that gives you the right to take her? To raise her like she's yours? James met his gaze, unwavering. She is mine. King's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. James took a slow breath. If you care about Hope, you'll leave her alone. She's happy. She's safe. King smirked. Safe? No one's ever truly safe, Doctor. A silent threat. James' stomach twisted. King stepped closer, lowering his voice. Enjoy your time with her while you can, because one way or another, I always get what I want. Then, just as quickly as he had arrived, King turned and disappeared into the night. James let out a shaky breath. The war had begun, and he would do anything to win. The battle for Hope. A night of fear. James drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His meeting with Darius King played over and over in his mind. The cold look in the man's eyes, the quiet threat in his voice. James had dealt with difficult situations in his medical career. Children on the brink of death, parents breaking down in grief, the heavy burden of making life-altering decisions. But this was something else entirely. This was his family, his daughter. And now, he knew with certainty, Darius King wasn't going to back down. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw Margaret waiting for him on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the warm night air. She ran to the car before he could even turn off the engine. James, she gasped, her voice laced with fear. What happened? What did he say? James exhaled sharply, his body still rigid with tension. We need to talk inside. Margaret's face fell, but she nodded, quickly leading him inside. As they stepped into the house, James locked the door behind them, checking the security cameras before finally turning to face his wife. He wants her, James said, his voice low and filled with restrained anger. And he's not going to stop. Margaret's breath hitched. What do we do? James took her hands, squeezing them gently. We protect her. We prepare for anything. And we fight. Margaret swallowed hard, nodding. We need a plan. James didn't sleep that night. He sat in Hope's room, watching her as she slept peacefully in her crib, completely unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their doorstep. He had never felt fear like this before, but he had also never felt such unwavering determination, strength in numbers. The next morning, James and Margaret took action. They couldn't do this alone. The first person they called was Lillian. When she arrived at the house, she could immediately sense the tension in the air. Tell me everything, she said firmly. James explained the situation. The letters, the phone call, the meeting with Darius King. Lillian's face darkened. I knew Vanessa ran with dangerous people, but I never imagined she was mixed up with him. She looked at James and Margaret, her expression fierce. He doesn't get to take her. I don't care what blood says. Hope is ours. James nodded. We need to make sure the law sees it that way, too. That's when they called Diane Evans, the social worker who had overseen Hope's case. When Diane arrived, they laid out everything for her. I don't understand, she admitted, flipping through Hope's adoption file. King never came forward during the initial search for relatives. If he's truly her father, why now? James clenched his jaw. Either he didn't know, or he didn't care. Until now. Diane sighed. This complicates things, if he can prove he's the biological father. He's a criminal, Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. That has to count for something. Diane nodded. It does. But we'll need solid evidence to prove that he's unfit. Family courts always favor biological parents if they're deemed stable. James crossed his arms. Stable? He's been arrested for drug trafficking, attempted murder. Diane held up a hand. I know, and that will help us. But we need to be careful. If he files for custody, this could turn into a long, ugly battle. Margaret's hands trembled. So what do we do? Diane took a deep breath. You need a lawyer, a damn good one. Preparing for battle. By that afternoon, James and Margaret sat in the office of one of the best family attorneys in the city, Eleanor Hartwell. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with piercing gray eyes and a reputation for winning impossible cases. She skimmed through the file, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady. "You have a case," she said, "but it won't be easy." Margaret exhaled shakily. "We're not giving up." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Good, because this will be a war." She leaned back in her chair. "We need to prepare for every possible attack. First, we'll get a restraining order. It won't stop him if he's truly dangerous, but it will create a legal barrier. Second, we need to gather as much evidence as possible. His criminal record, testimonies from people who know him, anything that proves he's a danger to Hope." James nodded. "What about his claim of paternity?" Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's where things get complicated. If he pushes for a DNA test and it confirms he's the father, he will have legal grounds for custody." Margaret's stomach twisted. "And if he's not?" Eleanor exhaled. "Then this could all be a scare tactic." James frowned. "Why would he do that?" Eleanor's gaze darkened. "Because men like him don't just want children. They want power, control. He might see Hope as leverage." Margaret felt sick. The idea of Hope being used as a pawn in some dangerous man's game made her blood boil. Eleanor tapped her pen against the desk. "You said he threatened you." James nodded. "Not directly, but he made it clear he doesn't intend to walk away." Eleanor smirked. "Then he's made a mistake." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes gleamed. "He just proved he's a threat. That gives us ammunition." James and Margaret exchanged a glance. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, they felt like they had a fighting chance. The custody war begins. 3 days later, Darius King officially filed for custody. The papers arrived at their home, delivered by a court officer. Margaret nearly collapsed when she saw them. "This is real," she whispered, clutching the papers. "This is really happening." James pulled her into his arms. "We were ready for this." But readiness didn't make it any less terrifying. Their first court hearing was scheduled in 3 weeks. In that time, they had to gather every piece of evidence, every shred of proof that Hope belonged with them. James spent hours meeting with investigators, while Margaret worked with Eleanor to document every moment of Hope's life. The milestones, the medical records, the photos proving she was in a stable, loving home. Lillian provided a sworn statement about Vanessa's history of drug use and neglect. Diane Evans submitted a report detailing how the Lawsons have been Hope's legal guardians since infancy. Then they received a shocking discovery. Eleanor stormed into their home one evening, her eyes blazing. "We just got confirmation from an old police informant. Darius King never believed Hope was his daughter." James frowned. "Then why?" "Because he owes someone money." Eleanor threw a file down on the table. "And there's only one thing more valuable than cash in his world: leverage." Margaret's breath caught. "You mean he wants to sell her?" Eleanor's expression was grave. "It wouldn't be the first time criminals have used family courts to launder children into illegal adoption schemes. If we don't stop him, there's a chance Hope could disappear." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "Over my dead body." James' jaw tightened. "Then we fight harder." The threat escalates. The night before their first court hearing, James and Margaret heard something shatter downstairs. James grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and rushed down. The living room window was broken, and spray painted across the wall were 3 chilling words: "She belongs to me." Margaret gasped behind him, clutching her chest. James turned to her, his voice deadly calm. "Call the police." This was no longer just a legal battle. This was war, and they would not lose. The final battle, the breaking point. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Every seat was filled. Lawyers, journalists, even strangers who had been drawn in by the high-profile nature of the case. The story of Hope's custody battle had spread, making headlines. Doctor couple fights to keep adopted child from notorious criminal. James and Margaret sat side by side at the front of the courtroom, their hands tightly clasped under the table. Hope was at home with Lillian, unaware that her future was being decided in this sterile, impersonal room. Across from them, Darius King sat with his attorney, his expression unreadable. He wore an expensive suit, but nothing about him looked refined. His sharp eyes bore into James like a predator watching its prey. Eleanor Hartwell, their attorney, straightened her papers, then leaned toward them. "Stay calm," she murmured. "We've built a strong case. This isn't just about emotions, it's about facts." Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. James clenched his jaw, his mind replaying everything that had led them here. The threats, the broken window, the chilling words "she belongs to me" still painted in his nightmares. This was it, the final battle for Hope. The case begins. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern but fair expression, cleared her throat. "This court is now in session to determine the custodial rights of the minor child known as Hope Lawson." She turned to Darius King's lawyer. "Mr. Hastings, you may present your client's case." Hastings stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. King, is the biological father of Hope. He was not made aware of her existence until recently, and he has come forward now to fulfill this parental duty." Margaret's fists clenched under the table. Parental duty. The man hadn't cared about Hope until she became useful to him. Hastings continued, "Mr. King has demonstrated financial stability, a willingness to be involved in his daughter's life, and most importantly, he is her biological parent." Eleanor was already shaking her head as she stood to respond. "Your Honor, while Mr. King may claim to be Hope's biological father, the burden of proof is on him to demonstrate that he is a fit parent." She turned, gesturing toward the Lawsons. "Dr. and Mrs. Lawson have raised Hope since infancy. They have provided her with a safe, loving, and stable home. Mr. King, on the other hand, has an extensive criminal history, including drug trafficking and violent offenses. The only reason this case is even being heard today is because of his biological claim. But biology alone does not make someone a parent." The judge nodded, then turned to Hastings. "Do you have evidence proving Mr. King's paternity?" Hastings smirked and handed a folder to the court clerk. "Yes, Your Honor. A DNA test has confirmed that Mr. King is, in fact, the biological father of Hope." A murmur spread through the courtroom. James felt Margaret tense beside him, but Eleanor remained unfazed. "Thank you, Mr. Hastings," the judge said. "Ms. Hartwell, do you wish to respond?" Eleanor stood again. "Your Honor, we do not dispute the DNA results. What we do dispute is whether Mr. King is fit to be a father." She walked slowly toward the judge's bench. "Biological connection aside, we must examine the best interests of the child. And in this case, that means considering Mr. King's violent past." She handed a thick file to the clerk. "Your Honor, we submit evidence of Mr. King's criminal record, including multiple arrests for drug-related offenses, illegal firearm possession, and violent assaults." The judge flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable. Hastings stood. "Your Honor, my client has served his time. He is a changed man." Eleanor smirked. "A changed man. Your Honor, may I submit Exhibit B?" The clerk handed another document to the judge. Eleanor turned back to the court. "This is a witness statement from a former associate of Mr. King's, a man who has agreed to testify under oath that Mr. King still has ties to criminal enterprises." A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge turned to Hastings. "How do you respond to these allegations?" Hastings sighed, rubbing his temples. "Your Honor, we argue that Mr. King's past should not define his future as a father. A child belongs with their biological parent unless proven otherwise." The judge nodded. "And that is what we are here to determine." The testimonies. The first witness called to the stand was Lillian Barnes. Margaret gripped James' hand as Lillian walked confidently to the stand. She adjusted her reading glasses before speaking into the microphone. "I am Hope's grandmother," she began, her voice unwavering. "I've watched the Lawsons raise her with love and care. I have no doubt that she is safe, happy, and thriving in their home." She turned to Darius King, her eyes sharp. "But I also know about the kind of people my daughter surrounded herself with. I have no doubt that if Hope is taken from the Lawsons and placed with Mr. King, she will not have the same safety she has now." Hastings stood. "Ms. Barnes, did you have any prior contact with my client?" Lillian narrowed her eyes. "No, because my daughter never mentioned him. If he was so concerned about his child, why didn't he come forward earlier?" Hastings hesitated. Eleanor smiled. No further questions. Next, James and Margaret took the stand. Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Hope is our daughter in every way that matters. We have spent sleepless nights caring for her, teaching her, loving her. She is the center of our world." Hastings smirked. "And yet you are not her biological mother." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Being a parent is not about DNA. It's about who is there when the child wakes up crying at night. It's about who holds them when they're sick, who teaches them to love and trust. We are Hope's parents." James testified next, keeping his voice calm and measured. "I'm a doctor. I have seen too many children lost in the system because the courts favored biological connection over stability. Hope deserves more than that. She deserves a life free from fear." Finally, Eleanor called her final witness, a former gang member who had worked with Darius King. The man, a tired-looking figure with tattoos covering his arms, took a deep breath before speaking. "King doesn't care about that little girl," he said bluntly. "He only wants her because he owes people money. A child is leverage in his world." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Eleanor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe we've proven that Mr. King is unfit." The verdict. The judge sat in silence for a long time, flipping through notes. The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, she spoke. "This court has carefully reviewed the evidence presented. While Mr. King has proven biological paternity, this court must rule in the best interests of the child. Based on the overwhelming evidence of Mr. King's criminal activity and the stability of the Lawson household." She looked up. "This court awards full and permanent custody of Hope Lawson to Dr. James Lawson and Mrs. Margaret Lawson." A collective breath of relief filled the courtroom. Margaret burst into tears, clutching James as he exhaled deeply. Lillian wiped her eyes, nodding in approval. Across the courtroom, Darius King stood slowly, his jaw clenched. "This isn't over," he murmured as he turned and walked out. But it was. Hope was safe. Forever. A new dawn. That evening, James and Margaret walked into Hope's room. She was playing with her dolls, oblivious to the battle that had just been fought for her. James knelt down, pulling her into his arms. "We love you, baby girl." Margaret kissed her curls. "And no one is ever taking you away from us." Hope giggled, wrapping her tiny arms around them. And for the first time in months, James and Margaret felt truly at peace.